Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Let's Move It Intervention Research Project closing seminar. I'm Nelli Hankonen, and I'll just introduce you to the program briefly and do some housekeeping remarks before we get on to the program. So we have a program where we haven't timed any breaks in between because we have a very packed program. We'll just give an overview in a nutshell of the program in 3.5 hours, and still we would like to keep you here for a couple of more days that we could share everything. So that's why we have decided to not have any breaks in between, so you can go to the toilet, which you can find downstairs during some talks. And also, of course, due to our sedentary behavior reduction objective, we welcome you to stand up and move around during the talks also. We are very used to that. And also, I would invite you to, if you want, stand up always when we switch the presenter. You don't have to stand up if you don't want, but it's an opportunity for you to kind of get some blood flowing. We also have coffee for the registered participants, for the quickest of you. We have almost 100, or even more than 100 registered participants. Some of them will be coming a bit later, so while the coffee is still there, help yourselves. We also have here some printouts of project products, research articles, some posters, as well as then intervention materials. You can find them all online. Maybe that will be the best place to catch them because the printouts are running out soon. We also have produced, during these 6.5 years, quite many data sets. Most of them we will share openly for use of other researchers as well. Some data collection materials can already be found on Open Science Framework, and during this year we will anonymize the data and then publish those data that the research participants have allowed us to share for open use. You have hopefully the program available. It can be also found on the tables. So we'll start with background and some insights from the development phase of the intervention, theoretical background and so on. And then go on to process evaluation, so discovering what happened during the randomized control trial, where we investigated more than 1,100 students and several hundred teachers. So Keegan Knittle will tell about the teacher sub-intervention, and me and Elina Renko will shed light on the qualitative process evaluation, student interviews, and then Matti Heino will talk about quantitative evaluation and future avenues for that, and then I will give some insight into the processes and effectiveness of the trial. Oh, and on Twitter, you can use hashtag Let's Move It to talk about this seminar. Thank you very much. And then finally, after that, we will hear from Professor, Director of UKK Institute, Tommi Vasankari, some evaluation of the trial results. And then, as a final presentation, Elina Renko will talk about the key project, where we were able to disseminate the best bits, optimize further the best bits of the Let's Move It intervention, and disseminate it to Finnish vocational schools. And then Professor of Sports Psychology, Taru Lintunen, will give a commentary after that. So I'm really, really very delighted that we have come to this in the project, even though this is called the closing seminar, because the official funding from the Ministry of Education has come to an end. I would like to think of this only as an intermediate milestone, because obviously all these rich data sets that we have collected will be used many years from now still to learn about physical activity and sensory behavior change. So, proceeding to the first talk, I will introduce myself. So, I will talk about the development of the program, The program is currently, or the project has been situated in the behavior change and well-being research area in social psychology of the University of Helsinki. But obviously, social psychologists cannot tackle these problems alone. We have had to have a wide steering group, multidisciplinary co-investigator team to help us tackle this multidimensional problem. We have had fantastic co-investigators from abroad and from Finland to help us tackle the various scientific issues. Practical support from practitioners and health promotion organizations has been vital. We don't want to do these kinds of projects in the academic ivory tower, but we really need practical insights, so thank you for all those. And then the absolutely amazing team who have made, through their hard work and intelligence and enthusiasm, made all these phases happen. And what I really want to point out also to the funders, thank you so much to the Ministries of Education and Culture, Social and Health Affairs, and Academy of Finland for enabling these studies. All right, where did we begin? In 2013, the National Physical Activity Recommendation for older adolescents included minimum of 1.5 hours of physical activity and less than 2 hours of screen time per day. So sedentary behavior was operationalized as screen time in those days mostly. But the sad facts from the school health survey showed that only half of vocational students reported engaging in MBPA more than 1 hour per week. So really not reaching the recommendations at all. There was about 20% difference to high schoolers, of which a third were very inactive, reporting less than 1 hour of physical activity per week. Also screen time was quite high. Some socioeconomic differences already there also. So in autumn 2013, I presented this vision in one of the project meetings. So we wanted to reach to a goal in 2014 to have an intervention program that would be shown to be feasible and acceptable in a pilot study, and that we would develop it carefully based on good existing practices in Finland, learning of what's really going on well already, because there are a lot of good things already done in Finnish schools. For example, Liikkuva Koulu program was vital in our development work as well. Then drawing on scientific evidence from international studies and behavior change theories, and then also feedback from schools, teachers, principals, students, on whether it is feasible. And then after that, we would proceed to have shown in a comparative design an effect on physical activity, also long term. That time we still thought that it would be possible to conduct a 2-year follow-up in vocational school context, but later on we had to realize that it wouldn't be feasible to have such a long follow-up. And then we also envisioned that the intervention program, if it's effective, would be disseminated into Finnish vocational schools and would reach every vocational student. So this is where we began. And so, for example, just diminishing the gap between inactive vocational school students to the level of high schools. Obviously, it's not realistic to expect to change everyone anyway in any intervention study. Okay, so not reinvent the wheel, we wanted to also do a systematic review of what's been done before, and found that there is a huge gap in evidence in this area. So where in younger age groups there are lots of studies on school-based interventions on physical activity, in older adolescents, 15 to 19-year-olds, only 10 randomized trials had been conducted. They had not used the optimal methodological solution. So, for example, self-reported physical activity was the outcome measure, and few of them had even evaluated long-term effectiveness of the intervention, and those who had realized that their intervention didn't have long-term effects. And also sedentary behavior hadn't been much studied. So clearly there was a call also from the research perspective in this area. So our aim was to develop an effective and cost-effective intervention to increase physical activity and decrease sedentary behavior, and targeting especially youth low in physical activity. Obviously there are lots of students that already engage in physical activity, so our design and development activity is focused on those individuals who currently aren't active and are not motivated to physical activity. We also wanted the program to be acceptable, feasible and practicable to be delivered in vocational schools, partially within the health education curriculum, and disseminable nationwide. And we were in contact with the Board of Education already quite early on to make sure that our intervention would fit the curricular demands. So as in many, international guidelines suggest that you proceed phase-wise in tackling these complex behavior change programs. So to learn from past programs, to understand theory, and to really carefully model the theoretical hypothesized mechanisms of action, we engaged in the development phase in careful preliminary work. And then before going on to the definitive evaluation of effectiveness, it is recommended to do a pilot study to investigate the feasibility and to optimize the intervention, and then proceed to the implementation so that the activities are not forgotten in academic research articles only. I will go through these two phases in my time in the next 45 minutes. But as you see, lots of our learnings have been published as research articles, so you're very welcome to seek out these articles and read more in those. And then the RCT evaluation of 1,100 students. The next talks by Keegan, Elina, and Matti will focus on them. And then Elina's talk on implementation will shed light on what we did to disseminate the program in practice. Intervention development frameworks that we drew mostly from are intervention mapping approach and the behavior change wheel. They both share some features, but both have unique features that I thought that would be helpful support in developing the program. These common features of key steps are analyzing the problem and developing an intervention objective carefully. So really trying to understand what the problem is about, and then making a diagnosis, and thereby designing the treatment, so the behavioral scientific core. How to tackle this problem? How do we want to address it? And then, based on this diagnosis and treatment plan, design intervention materials, and then conduct an empirical optimization in a feasibility study. So let's go on to looking at this development, what we were doing. So we conducted empirical studies to understand what's going on in Finnish vocational schools and Finnish youth and teachers. We did some literature reviews and also collaborated with stakeholders. We, from very early on, actually started small-scale pre-testing with a student panel to test out various intervention activities and what the feel of it was, and kind of iteratively built into the first version of the intervention. So Sini Hynynen was quite vital in this student program building at those times. So when we're talking about the objectives, we wanted to, of course, increase total physical activity. That can be divided into increasing physical activity and then decreasing sedentary behavior. So how do we go about understanding how to get there? The behavior change wheel recommends an analysis starting from this generic theoretical framework that suggests that all behaviors, in order to take place, require sufficient capabilities. So physiological physical skills and psychological skills to self-regulate the behavior. You also have to be motivated, so to have sufficient or reflective motivation and automatic motivation to want to perform the behavior, and then opportunities, so conducive social and physical environments and resources to actually enact the behavior. And our first analysis, of course, when we look at this with the intervention development team internally, we can conclude that in Finnish adolescents, there are things to improve in most of these domains, except for physical ability to engage in leisure time activities. Everyone has the skills to engage in physical skills to engage in leisure time physical activity. But we dug deeper into this with individual interviews. We also had a writing competition for Finnish youth to understand their influences on their physical activity over the life course. To get some generalizable understanding of the needs of the youth, we conducted a survey, also to look at the theoretical determinants of motivation and behavior, and then also investigated at schools what's going on there. And just one example of our preliminary studies, we tried to investigate potential correlates of physical activity in Finnish youth. And I will now give you a chance to select, what do you think, what are the important factors that are related to physical activity in Finnish youth? So actually it's easier to ask the other way around, what is not related, because only one factor was not related to the physical activity behavior, and that was the correct knowledge of physical activity recommendation. And this corroborates the quite usual finding in behavioral science that knowledge alone and providing information alone is really insufficient to create behavior change. So it's a really complex problem, and various self-regulatory behaviors regarding capability to self-regulate your behavior, opportunities, social influences, material resources play a role, obviously, and then motivational factors also. So basically, we started to build the program theory that would incorporate the wide variety of influences on physical activity behavior. From the systematic review, we also coded the behavior change techniques, BCTs, from previous intervention studies. And it seemed, even though it was a really small number of studies, it seemed that the effective interventions were characterized by some core behavior change techniques. Effectively, graded tasks, so gradually building your behavioral goals into larger goals and not trying very high goals at once. Coping planning, meaning identifying barriers for physical activity in your own life and designing solutions, how to overcome those barriers, and then self-monitoring of your physical activity. And these are all linked to the capability domain of behavioral determinants, so self-regulatory strategies to tackle behavior. Also, effective interventions tended to have more behavior change techniques, so a wider variety of behavior change techniques rather than fewer. So then, of course, we were interested in how to then increase the uptake of these self-regulation techniques in youth. And Johanna Nurmi's study, in this one we looked whether what kind of motivation plays a role in predicting the uptake of these skills. And here we were able to show that it was not only the strength and amount of motivation that played a role, but also the quality of motivation. So over and above the strength of the motivation, autonomous motivation predicted the uptake of self-regulatory techniques. how many of you have heard about quality of motivation before? You can actually raise your hand. Yes, so I will just tell briefly about this. So many of you might have heard about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. Let's see whether you want to test out these questionnaire items related to motivation quality. So you might get a slightly different feel of the questionnaire items on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. And these items on the left-hand side characterize controlled forms of motivation. So motivation which is driven by external pressures or sense of internalized pressures such as shame or anxiety. And then these are items tap autonomous forms of motivation, self-determined motivations that is characterized by wanting to do a behavior because you enjoy it, or because you find it interesting, or because you find it's important, it serves values important to you. And some researchers actually call this mustivation and this wantivation. So this is about must and this is about want. What self-determination theory-based research has found is that behaviors that are driven by autonomous motivation, they are sustained more over the long term. It's characterized by higher quality of performance and also leads to better mental well-being. So that's why we want to emphasize autonomous motivation in most behavior change programs. We obviously, all of us have in our motivational cocktail or mix features of both controlled and autonomous motivation. But we would like to try to shift the emphasis of our motivation into the autonomous forms of motivation, also in health promotion efforts, because of its beneficial effects. And why is self-determination theory a social psychological theory and not an individual psychological theory? Because crucially, social interaction and social environments can influence the sense of the quality of motivation. So by different interaction techniques, you can nurture the sense of autonomous motivation or then also controlled motivation. Elina Renko will speak more about these motivational interaction techniques in her talk after 3 o'clock. So this has been actually one of the favorite parts by teachers in our dissemination phase, to learn more about motivational interaction and how to support higher quality motivation in others. So this is one version of the program theory related to physical activity in the Let's Move It program. It's actually a simplified version because it includes factors or determinants which we have measured. So here you see the first part, like in the combi model of behavior change, motivation variables are painted yellow. So we drew from a reasoned action approach and mainly self-determination theory to understand how people get motivated. And then behavioral self-regulation bridges the gap from intention to behavior. And then obviously we need environmental opportunities to engage in physical activity. We have to be motivated to grab the environmental opportunities, but motivation alone and self-regulation alone doesn't suffice if there are few of them. So this is a simple form of the physical activity program theory of the Let's Move It intervention. And we will get back to this later in the show. Can I call it a show? In the seminar. There are a lot of other empirical studies that we conducted, but we won't go into detail with those here. For the literature reviews, we also wanted to learn what other school-based health promotion in younger age groups had found out to be effective features in such programs. So one core feature is a careful design of the program. Using theory helps focus on or explicate the systems or the mechanisms by which you want to reach the outcomes. And of course, engaging the target group in intervention design. I wanted to say, so basically we want to make a distinction between formal theories like self-determination theory, control theory, reasoned action approach, and then the program theory, which incorporates features of many different formal behavior change theories. And then using several components to target behavior, also reflecting what we found out in our own systematic review in previous studies, that multiple behavior change techniques are better than fewer. And also not resorting to classroom-based education alone, attending social influences, targeting cognitive behavioral skills. And then ensuring intervention fidelity, meaning that we want to not only design a beautiful program, but then no one ever implements it. It doesn't get done in practice. And then interestingly, also partnerships outside school is quite useful to have, according to these reviews. Then, of course, as I mentioned, collaborating with stakeholders is really crucial to understand what's going on in the schools and how our planned activities would, in practice, work. And student panel was helpful in pre-testing some of the intervention activities very early on, before the feasibility study. We had experienced physical education teachers' practices and ideas, health promotion organizations' experiences and know-how. And what I also have to say is that when we were designing the classroom-based program to reduce sitting, it was really useful for Hanna Laine, who was leading the development of the sitting reduction program. She went to some teachers' classrooms who had used already for years quite activating practices as part of their teaching, and compiled this set of variety of classroom-based sitting reduction activities from various sources and existing practices in Finland. They didn't exist, such clear lists didn't exist back then. And then intervention ideas and scenarios were first brainstormed with the stakeholders and experts, and then in later phases shortlisted and evaluated. So, for example, we would present a scenario like, okay, how would it sound that we have 5 lessons within the health education course teaching children these self-regulation skills, and then we would have our expert stakeholder team go through these different scenarios and rating their challenges and potential and how to improve that scenario. And then in addition to that, various intervention elements that had been brainstormed beforehand, they also evaluated the potential of these to be included in the multi-component program. And then the intervention development team at the University of Helsinki worked to kind of analyze their comments and understand kind of what would be feasible and practicable. And yeah, so how did we make these decisions? What would be appropriate and what would have potential? So there are a lot of selections that you have to make during intervention development. And these were core decision-making criteria that we used, drawing from behavior change wheel and intervention mapping. So just briefly going through them. So, of course, interventions need to be affordable relative to the resources, and we obviously didn't have a lot of resources, so we had to take care that our planned activities wouldn't cost too much. Also, they need to be practicable and feasible in their context, and they need to be effective. Where we have evidence of effectiveness from previous studies, we try to use that, or ineffectiveness, so that we wouldn't use ineffective strategies. Acceptability is important. Also, that we wouldn't produce unintended side effects or harm. So specifically what we were aware of, that we didn't want to increase dysfunctional body image ideals, for example, because those kind of things can easily be linked to physical activity, so we wanted to avoid those harms. Also, various sports injuries we wanted to prevent, and also various eating disorders that might also be linked to these issues. And equity means that the interventions that people design shouldn't increase socioeconomic inequalities in health. And then one important criterion was also the changeability. Like, how realistic is it for us to design activities that, for example, this determinant or this objective can be changed? So some examples from these. So the objective to reduce screen time came from the national recommendations of physical activity. So we first started out with, okay, let's see if we can reduce screen time. In our needs assessment survey, covering more than 700 people, we asked students how acceptable they feel this intervention objective to be, how motivated they are to reduce their screen time. And it was very low acceptability, because a huge majority of them said that we are satisfied with our screen time now, and we just thought that it's probably not changeable then. So we modified objective to include wider a variety of sedentary behaviors. And so obviously students spend most of their time sitting in school, and then decided to kind of conceptualize sedentary behavior, not as screen time, but as sitting reduction in school. I have heard of one intervention in Australia, I heard, that was able to successfully reduce screen time in adolescents, but I've only heard of one successful intervention study so far. But anyway, so we thought that it would be perhaps most feasible to go to the environments and change them. And then, of course, in this kind of intervention objective, teachers would be the key environmental agents, and the interventions has to be acceptable also to them. So we conducted some school staff survey and teacher surveys to see what they are already doing, what strategies they already use, and which strategies they would like to try. So we might be able to shortlist some of these strategies in the intervention program. And then also interviewed some teachers about their wishes, worries, and challenges behind these answers. Actually, there was quite a variety in teacher preferences. So some teachers wanted to do activity breaks, whereas some other teachers wanted to incorporate activity within the teaching so that the students wouldn't even notice that they are reducing the sitting. So we ended up providing quite a lot of choice to teachers in the intervention program, also to support their autonomous motivation and sense of meaningfulness of the activities. Going further, another example of using the decision-making criteria, so previous studies and also our preliminary studies show that friends are really important for physical activity of youth, so it would be an effective way to intervene, but it's difficult to directly target and change. So the practicability and changeability in such a school-based intervention was deemed to be low. So then we decided not to intervene on friends directly, because most of the vocational school students have friends from earlier life years. They might not even be the classmates that they are mostly friends with. So we decided to teach ways in which the youth may obtain social support. So these factors when then considered. These are hard choices, like always. And then one last example of balancing between these criteria. So effective features of intervention, as for example, higher dose of intervention activities and specific intervention content. We had to balance out, okay, whether to include this. This would be very effective, but it would cost very much, or it wouldn't be practicable in the long term to disseminate in schools. So, very frustrating situation. You cannot do what's optimal, but what is feasible. Or try to do optimal and feasible both at the same time. So, for example, what we had considered in 2014, but had to leave out from the student intervention, here are some examples. So we considered using incorporating mental rehearsal practices in the classroom based sessions and individualized feedback and guidance, and so also elements targeting behavior change maintenance for habit formation for the students, but the slots available for us were too slow. It would have cost too much. It wouldn't be scalable and disseminable. So we had to leave these aspects out completely. And then some points about the intervention development as a really creative process and truly unpredictable, and how it's really useful to have many people thinking about the same issues, because you might get from really unpredictable sources interesting ideas. So for example, one master's student who was writing her master's thesis about the writing competition, she found a theory by Unruh about physical activity identity. So we used this to form a basis for a discussion exercise to help students reflect their dichotomous view of themselves as non-exercisers. So this is kind of this black and white thought of, okay, I'm not the sporty type, physical activity is not part of my self-concept, might be one kind of really usual barrier for non-exercisers. So we wanted to challenge this and use these Unruh's theories terms to help them think of ways in which they already are physically active, and noticing that this is not kind of a very stable identity, and that all of us are already active in some ways, and physical activity identity may well change over the life course. And in order to be the sporty type, you don't have to love all types of physical activity. So this created quite interesting discussions, and many students liked this. Okay, so what else did the intervention then contain? We created 6 principles, let's move it principles, to facilitate people's understanding of what the core beliefs we endorse and on the basis of which we, where we come from. So we started emphasizing really this, that any activity is better than nothing, and even small increases in physical activity will bring health benefits. So to just challenge this idea that, well, I'm never going to reach the national recommendation, it's so unreachable that I might as well just never do anything. But really pointing out that even small increases actually benefit you. And then also that the physical activity is everyone's own choice. We didn't want to force it down anyone's throats, and in that way also try to prevent resistance and reactance to our intervention activities. We also wanted to show to youth that actually we are all entitled to physical activity. It's something that our body is evolved to enjoy and need, and you don't have to be a certain size or shape of a person to be enjoying physical activity and sports. We also wanted to help people understand and know what is motivating for them and what kind of activities they can build into their daily lives, and emphasizing the intrinsic goal of well-being, and trying to kind of actively dissociate physical activity from weight loss, because that might also be that belief might be one barrier for many. So we really wanted to dissociate physical activity from too much emphasis on looks. And back then, the disadvantages of sitting and too much sedentary behavior were not very well disseminated, so that was one of our principles as well. Before going to details about the program, I'll give you an overview of the program. So we ended up having this group program for students with 6 weekly sessions, targeting motivation for physical activity and building capabilities, self-regulation skills to regulate own behavior. And we used active, engaging teaching methods, not this kind of lecturing like boring, not at all, trust me. It was much more interesting, I hope. And also kind of built-in discussions and pair exercises where quite a lot of personalization and tailoring happened within the exercises, within the framework of the lesson. And then creating opportunities. So we try to enhance physical activity availability to school facilities. We made deals with physical activity service providers in the neighborhood of the school so that students could actually go out and try new ways of being active with cheaper options in their neighborhoods, because the 6 weekly sessions actually, they included kind of physical activity behavior, you know, trying out various forms of physical activity to reinforce the program messages as well. And then we created home workout videos in Finnish, targeted at students with low levels of fitness and physical activity. And then also creating the opportunities for sitting reduction by training teachers in various sitting reduction skills. And then online resources and poster campaign were supporting these messages. So basically, what it in a simplified way contained for the increased physical activity, it included physical activity experiments, motivation, self-regulation, and then for the sedentary behavior, intervening on the school environment, and then enabling these resources for physical activity. So as you see, this maps onto the colors of yellow motivation, red capability, and green environment. And whereas physical activity at leisure time is something that students actually, in our current society, we have to take initiative and make an effort to actually be physically active. So thereby kind of the student agentic active role was emphasized there. But for the decreased sedentary behavior, the logic model basically went through the environmental changes, because also evidence shows that sitting behavior, sedentary behaviors are really driven by our environments more than our conscious motivations. And as I said already, there are several levels of influence that we try to take into account, even sent parents a letter that they shouldn't, that their children are now participating in this trial, but please don't pressure them in a controlled way to exercising. An overview of the student sessions that will be given in the paper later. They start logically building from kind of motivational issues, building the motivation, exploring people's motivation, also looking at like how sedentary our lifestyle in current society is, then emphasizing the kind of pros of lifestyle activity, so how you can add tips on how to add lifestyle activity in your daily life. Then getting more and more into kind of more specific forms of goal setting and action planning, and making people realize what various physical activity opportunities exist. So all the student groups were encouraged to create a map of various physical activity opportunities in their school, in their neighborhood, digital opportunities for physical activity, what they can do in their home, and so on. And then planning in a smart way, not setting too high goals for one's physical activity to start with, not too low, and creating action plans, then coping planning or problem solving to tackle barriers, and then creating solutions. And in the final session, just recapping the important messages, thinking about one's own physical activity relationship, and how to plan for the future. And this was then complemented, these messages were reinforced in the poster campaign in the schools, and then on a booster session later on. We have mapped these theoretical determinants to the intervention content, but I won't go into detail of these in here. I'll just show you one example intervention activity. So identifying personal motives group activity, where participants are shown cards on the table. They were invited to select cards with known positive consequences of physical activity, framed as benefits of physical activity, and focusing on short-term benefits, not like long-term chronic disease prevention benefits, because we know that's not very motivating to youth. And then they were invited to choose a card with a reason that they would personally want to be physically active, but they weren't forced to do it, because if they didn't find a reason, we didn't force them to choose the card. And then afterwards, everybody in a circle talked to the group about the card and why they had chosen this card. So there were a variety of short-term benefits of physical activity. So mapping these onto the theoretical determinants, so basically this exercise tried to change outcome expectations, so realizing that, okay, what all benefits physical activity might bring. Autonomous motivation, because they were invited to think about what is personally relevant to them, and descriptive norm, so perception that actually quite many of my peers talk positively about physical activity, so maybe it's quite okay. And then from motivational interviewing, change talk, so we invited them to produce talk that kind of was in favor of changing. So this exercise focused on these determinants of physical activity in the program theory. Then one other example was tackling the physical activity misperceptions. So in small groups, the students were invited to discuss these fitspiration posters that endorse like really extreme forms of physical activity, no pain, no gain, kind of really extreme focus on looks and so on and so forth. And then the facilitator led the discussion afterwards to make them truly realize that, these very prevalent ideas in media are not what we endorse. Physical activity doesn't have to be like this. Endorsing autonomous goal motivation, smart goal setting of useful goals, and self-efficacy. And these actually, we have published this Let's Move It website for physical education teachers and instructions on how to carry out these exercises or practices and discussion exercises in their own class. It was very well liked. And behavioral self-regulation, here are some materials. So we show an example of how they can self-monitor their physical activity. They were also invited to use their self-selected mobile app to do it, and how to specify goals into concrete action plans in order to bridge the gap from general goals and intentions to actual behavior. Elina will talk more about this in the qualitative process evaluation. And then coping planning skills were introduced, for example, by this exercise where the students were invited to act as personal trainers to solve physical activity barriers of model stories of their similar youth, and then realizing that, okay, what kind of problems people might have in their physical activity plans and how to make them better. So, what about material design and production of the intervention itself? So just to remind you about the key steps in development. So now we are on phase 3, developing the materials. We had an ad agency design the looks of the posters, but it was still guided by theory and predefined principles. We created posters, teacher handbook, student workbook, and some home workout videos that looked like this. And so we wanted to really adhere to certain principles in the design of these things. So we had to, for example, say to the ad agency that, okay, one version of the campaign included very looks-focused messages. So look like muscular figures and so on. And we said that this is not something that we want to endorse in this campaign because youth anyway get these messages that might be conducive of controlled motivation from elsewhere. So just to be clear that we really reviewed the poster campaign from behavioral change theory perspective. So we didn't, in these posters guiding activity breaks, we didn't only say what and how to do it, but also why, talking about outcome expectations and benefits of physical activity, and promoting self-efficacy, that this is really easy to do. You can do it also. These were some of the materials that were disseminated in the schools and tables of cafeteria, and kind of also we can map them on the theoretical determinants. So descriptive norm, what other people think about physical activity, what are the outcome expectation benefits of physical activity, providing tips about how to incorporate very easy ways of being physically active, like, you know, getting off the bus one stop earlier, or other easy tips for physical activity. And also some messages enforcing self-regulation strategies. And like I said earlier, it's not important not only what we do in the intervention, but also how the intervention is delivered. So wanting to introduce or focus on autonomous forms of motivation, we drew from self-determination theory and motivational interviewing in the style in which the facilitators led the student sessions. Elina will come back to this in her talk. So how is it possible then to deliver these programs with high fidelity? We had a detailed manual for session facilitator on how to kind of go through the group discussions and how to make sure that the correct messages are delivered. And we report this session content mapping onto the activities on the theoretical determinants in a 19-page file of the student session. So if you're interested, I'm happy to send it to you. We also code this as the behavior change techniques that were delivered that can be also mapped onto the COMBI model of behavior change. These are the key BCTs delivered. So on to the feasibility study. So now I presented actually the final form of the intervention, but it was slightly different before the feasibility study because we learned a lot. We just realized that some things don't work at all, and we had to optimize before going on to the evaluation in the RCT. But I'll just show you this paper tells more about it if you're interested in reading more details about the feasibility study. But one fun and lucky core finding was that students really liked the program. They, and also teachers, found it something that they would like to recommend to their peers. And for example, some students said that most courses contain pretty much lecturing, so it's nice to get to do something and actually learn. And the other says, because I had left sports behind, so it's nice to try to get back on board and plan in smaller amounts. Make realistic plans so you can influence it. So we were encouraged by this feedback. But then also looking at kind of in a more detailed way, many health promotion programs don't have the luxury of being able to study what is going on. So we wanted to look at the fidelity, not only what the provider delivers in the sessions, but also how the participants actually receive and understand what the messages are, and whether they enact the skills that they learn in the intervention. So, of course, providers can deliver information on health consequences with high fidelity, but in order for that to have effect on behavior change, the participant has to understand the message as intended. And also, the provider can prompt self-monitoring, but the participant has actually to self-monitor in order for that behavior change technique to have an effect. In this study, in the feasibility study phase already, we then measured or asked students to self-report which of the skills and self-report, behavior change techniques they had enacted. So here is a list of the behavior change techniques that we expected them to kind of enact and that they were taught. I will just show them mapped onto the program theory. So for example, we asked whether they had reviewed the self-monitoring records. And we also asked whether they had thought about the personal physical activity motives and linked to their own values, that is influencing autonomous motivation. or whether they had tried to obtain social support for physical activity, and whether they had tried out new forms of physical activity during the program. And we asked them by these measures, these questions, behavior change technique enactment in the feasibility trial. So during the last 2 weeks, have you done the following? I have set PA goals for myself. I have self-monitored my physical activity. I have thought about why physical activity is personally important for me. And so what was really depressing, of course, is that right after the intervention, quite a lot of participants really said that they hadn't done this, even though they had participated in the sessions with us. So I think it's quite interesting and also helpful to understand which of the techniques they really take up and enact and which they don't, because that aids then in the optimization before going on to the randomized controlled large trial. So it's kind of a manipulation check, which we use in experimental research, whether the intervention group actually did what we thought, reveals which VCTs are used the most and the least. This was supplemented by interviews and qualitative data, of course. No, we didn't rely only on these self-reports. But this enabled optimization, so we designed more support to improve participant skills to enact the VCTs. For example, we gave concrete examples of action plans for physical activity and incorporated more discussion on how to obtain social support. And we also tried to motivate enacting these VCTs and give better rationales for using VCTs across the program after the feasibility study. So in the feasibility study already we had, even though it wasn't statistically powered, and the meaning wasn't to investigate the effectiveness of the intervention, so it was still nice to find that the intervention arm teachers had increased sitting reduction activities in the classroom. And then the article includes feedback and challenges that we identified in the feasibility study. Okay, so at this stage we have to reiterate what our aim was. So we have now found that the intervention was acceptable to students and staff. It was feasible and practicable. We had to do some tweaks and optimization due to the problems found. But still, we have to ask if it's disseminable and if it's effective and cost-effective. So going on to the evaluation and giving some background for the next talks. So the study design of the evaluation is reported in this protocol article in BMC Public Health, and it explains how we measured these things. We intervened in 6 vocational school units, or made measurements in 6 vocational school units, half of which were randomized to be control condition and half was the intervention condition. And we had to select educational tracks that would be balanced in both arms. And these tracks were selected based on a school health survey showing that these students didn't have high levels of activity, and also they were large enough tracks to be included in a large study so that we would have enough people to sample. Here's an overview of data collection. So here you can see the group sessions that were delivered to students. So the 6 sessions within the one study period. So we had to kind of design the intervention around the study periods of the vocational school curriculum, which is the same or approximately the same in most vocational schools, so about 2 months. And then workshops of teachers took place within the 2 first before the first measurement. Accelerometry refers to objective measurement of physical activity. I will tell you more about that. So that's kind of primary outcomes are measured by that. And then process evaluation. So all these theoretical determinants that I'd been speaking about before, they were measured in questionnaires at baseline in the intervention arm, mid-intervention as well, and then at 2 months after the intensive intervention. and then at 14 months, which was the final follow-up. Of course, questionnaires have their limitations, so we were happy to be able to interview both students and teachers to understand really, more about what's going on, and also to conduct follow-up interviews with the same students after 1 year. Bioimpedance was measured. Oh yeah, triangulation I mentioned. We are this year, later on, making sense of all these data and bringing it together to understand better what was going on in the trial and the experiences of both students and teachers. This is a bioimpedance measure that was used at baseline and then at 14 months to understand body composition, lean mass, fat mass in the students, because physical activity might have effects on that to supplement or complement the accelerometry measure of physical activity. So accelerometry is currently one of the state-of-the-art ways to measure physical activity. So we used UKK Institute's Hookie accelerometer, which is kind of a memory stick that then students were instructed to keep on the hip, and they were all given individualized advice, and they were also instructed that they shouldn't let the accelerometer influence what they would normally do during the measurement week. And then we used in the outcome analysis minimum of 4 days and 10 hours of physical activity to get a reliable estimate of the physical activity. Unfortunately, many people didn't wear it, even though we had really nice numbers of people accepting the accelerometer measure, but then not all of them wore it sufficiently to be included in the analysis. I will talk about that later. This is my final slide, and I won't read it out loud, but I just want to point out that we took various measures to minimize bias, to improve the reliability and validity of our trial and our conclusions, and these will be reported as part of our outcomes. So really just to reduce the risk of false conclusions. But it was quite a lot of work, and I thank all the measurement staff for bearing with me. So for example, we had to use the very strict protocol for participant contact because we couldn't blind personnel for treatment assignment. So all the research assistants were adhering to quite close scripts of how to give the accelerometer in identical ways to both intervention arm students and control arm students. We circulated staff between schools and arms to have similar operational procedures in all of the places. So this is kind of the introduction to the evaluation section that will now be started off by Keegan. But thank you for your attention so far. And yes, always when we change the speaker, you can use the opportunity to walk around and interrupt your sitting. If there are any acute questions, you can raise your hand. Yes, we will publish these slides later on our website. Are there any other? Don't direct it at me. I think that. Introduce you. Do you introduce yourself? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So it's the.
Now we're good? Okay, nice. I can hear myself. Um, my name is Keegan Knittle. I'm a colleague of Nelli's in the social sciences faculty, and I've only been partially involved in this project in what I'll tell you about now. But as a little bit of an outsider to the project, it's been a real honor to witness the project be developed from the ground up and to see the skill and expertise with which Nelli has pulled it all together. So it's been a great project to be involved in. So I'll talk to you a little bit about the teacher intervention. That was part of the Let's Move It overall intervention. And yeah, I rowed my boat into town this morning, and this was the scene. But as Nelli said, sedentary behavior is associated with a lot of undesirable outcomes, and it's very prominent in classrooms. And we've all been in a classroom, and a lot of times it looks something like this, where we have a teacher speaking and students sitting, the desks all pointed directly toward the front of the classroom. And it's very clear then, if a classroom is set up in that way, with the desks all pointing toward the teacher who's giving a presentation, that the classroom environment influences the amount of activity that these students are undertaking and the amount of time that they spend sitting. And as the teachers control the classroom, they have a way to control this environment. And therefore, teachers can promote physical activity and reductions in sedentary behavior via alterations they make to the environment. So if we're trying to promote this active teaching, what is an active classroom? Well, this is one example here. We see some students who all have desks, but the desks seem to be unused. The students are moving around the room, visiting different stations, adding their own information or obtaining information from others by moving around the room to access the information. We might also think of things like a gym ball that helps activate the core while sitting and using a computer or writing, or some standing desks like these two guys on the right have. We can also think of an active classroom as involving activities that get students out of their chairs, that get students to move around the classroom, or even taking the classroom outside of the classroom, utilizing the outdoors and other spaces as classroom settings. So if we have this idea of active teaching, and it has a couple of different components to it, what is it that predicts teachers' use of these active teaching styles? So one is environmental opportunities. You need the classroom to be set up in a particular way or have flexibility to extend beyond the borders of the classroom. And according to the theory used to develop this intervention, you need some levels of outcome expectations, what you think will happen if you use active teaching styles, norms, whether it's okay to use active teaching styles, whether your peers do it, and belief in your own capability, self-efficacy for using these active teaching styles. Also need an intention for using these active teaching styles, and that then leads into active teaching itself, and also some sort of habit or automaticity around active teaching styles helps predict active teaching in the long run. So if I do something repeatedly and it becomes part of what I do, it becomes automatic and it's likely to be maintained. So the first question of this teacher intervention was, can an intervention based on the reasoned action approach and habit formation theories increase teachers' use of sitting reduction strategies? And there are a number of, well, this is where the teacher intervention sits in the intervention overview that Nelli presented earlier. So we have our problem on the left, sedentary teaching, and we have our solution on the right, active teaching. And we get there via some theoretical mechanisms. We have the intervention, which hopes to change these reasoned action approach constructs within teachers. We want them to think that good things will happen if they use active teaching, that it's okay in their social contexts to use active teaching strategies, and that they have the abilities to do so, and that they then form intentions to do so. We think that these intentions then lead to the use of action planning and things like that, and by acting on these action plans, active teaching will occur, and that this over time will become automatic and help to sustain active teaching in the long run. So the teacher intervention, Nelli mentioned a little bit about it, but it had 3 90-minute work groups or workshops delivered to groups. There's some brief presentations and discussions, as well as some group tasks, which I'll go through in a minute. And each teacher received a workbook, some posters to hang in the classroom, similar to that one, and some light physical activity equipment, which I'll also show. And in between each of these workshops, they had the opportunities to practice the things that they had learned and came back to each session to discuss how it went when they practiced these things. So in the first workshop, teachers were first asked to identify their own motives for reducing student sitting. Whether or not they were doing it already or not, we asked them why they might want to in future. So we got responses like this. Students might be less anxious if they moved around more. Or students would be more healthy, of course important. Active classrooms are just important to me. It's a good thing to do as a teacher. And students might be able to concentrate better if they were able to use their energy and lose their energy in a way. So that was the first activity. Then teachers received some information about the ill effects of sedentary behavior and about the benefits of trying to reduce sitting in the classroom. And then the sitting reduction strategies were introduced. And these were found based on some formative research conducted by Hanna Laine. And these were specifically chosen as they would fit into the Finnish vocational school setting. So there were 4 different reduction strategies. First are active teaching strategies, and this involves something like this learning cafe shown here, where the students are free to move around to different stations within the classroom. This opinion poll cue, you might have the students stand up in a line, and if they agree with something, move forward, and if they disagree with something, move backwards. And one that we can try now, vote with your body. So everyone please just stand up, And I would like to know how you think my talk is going. So let me know by striking a pose. How is the talk going so far? I personally think it's going great, but okay, very good. Everyone seems to agree. He doesn't agree, he's seen better, but that's fine. Okay, so that's an idea. You can make it fun, you can get the people interacting with the content and moving at the same time. And this is one of the ideas that we're talking about there. GIFs are so much fun. The other thing would be active classrooms. So having students stand while other people are speaking, moving to the front of the classroom to collect materials, forming groups in an active way, moving around the classroom, and creatively using space. The third sitting reduction strategy was introducing activity breaks. So simply in the middle of a class saying, okay, now it's time for a break, and the Let's Move It team produced some videos, which the teachers could then click on and show on YouTube, and the students could then do some exercises at their place, just to break the sedentary behavior. And the fourth would be to utilize light physical activity equipment, such as gym balls, stability cushions, which you see there. It's just something you put in your chair and it makes it a little wobbly, so you have to use your abs. And some standing desks. And then during this workshop, the teachers had the chance to talk about how they might use these, and they actually practiced some of these in the workshop. And then we, similarly to the identity things that tried to happen with students, even trying one strategy is a good start. Even taking one step toward making a more active classroom is a good outcome. So emphasizing that. And then each teacher made an action plan for how they were going to use one of these strategies in practice. And between the sessions, the teachers monitored whether or not they carried out their plans that they'd made. They received some light physical activity equipment delivered to their classroom. Each classroom had 2 standing desks, a couple of the sitting balls and sitting cushions, and a gym stick to allow some exercise in the classroom. And in the second workshop, teachers first talked about how it went trying out these new strategies. They identified a couple of problems that prevented them from using the strategies, and then come up with some solutions to try and overcome those barriers. They then received information about habits and how habits can help to maintain actions in the long term, and about how to form habits. And then they created some habit formation plans, so a plan of how they were going to make active teaching a habit for them. And habit formation takes some time to occur, new habits have to form, and old habits have to go away. And in order for a habit to form, the action needs to be repeated a lot of times in response to the same cue and in the same situation. So the habit formation plans that we had teachers make look something like this. They would first choose the strategy that they wanted to use as a way to create active teaching. So, for example, have the students come to the front of the class to pick up materials, like the ones on this table over here. And then figure out when they were going to use this. So they identified a cue. If there are materials that need to be distributed, then I will ask the students to come to pick them up from the front of the room. And the idea was then that they would use this strategy every time that this cue was encountered. So every time a material needed to be distributed, students come to the front of the room. Distribute, come to the front of the room. Distribute, come to the front of the room. So it becomes a habit in that way. Now, what makes a good habit formation plan? Well, there are three things that we think are quite important. There might be a couple more, but I'll only list these. A habit formation plan should only target one behavior, not multiple behaviors. It should be some sort of a cue that is event-based, so something actually happens, so the class starts, or somebody is yawning, or it's 3 o'clock, something like that. And the habit formation plan should aim to increase behavior, not stop behavior. So, the second question we wanted to ask was, how good were the habit formation plans according to these criteria? And how often did teachers actually implement the plans that they had made? After the second session, teachers again went away for some independent practice, and they monitored the extent to which they used their habit formation plans for 3 weeks. At the end of 3 weeks, they received an email to continue using their habit formation plan, or if they wanted to make a new habit formation plan, and continued to monitor their use of habit formation plans for another 3 weeks before the third workshop. And in the third workshop, they then talked about their experiences of using these habit formation plans, identified some strategies to maintain sitting reduction practices in their classrooms, and discussed how the whole school as a system could help support sitting reduction practices and habit formation in this. So, can an intervention based on the reasoned action approach and habit formation theories increase teachers' use of sitting reduction strategies? And how well did teachers form habit formation plans, and how much did they enact these habit formation plans? Those are the questions we sought to answer with this. And we conducted a randomized controlled trial, or a sub-study within the main randomized controlled trial, which Nelli will present fully later on. And we had 117 teachers in the Let's Move It schools and 116 teachers in the control schools, who then, some of whom completed a baseline survey, and some of them then followed these workshops, and then some of them filled out a follow-up survey. So we had a little bit of dropout in this study. But what can we say? We have some results anyhow. Did the intervention increase teachers' use of sitting reduction strategies? So we asked a simple question. How often did you introduce sitting breaks? So if the students are sedentary for some time, get them to stand during the last 2 weeks. And they could say in around half of the classes, in around a quarter of the classes, or a few times in the past 2 weeks. And in the end, we showed a significant interaction effect, meaning that sitting breaks were increased in the intervention group relative to the control group. And at follow-up, we had an effect size of around 0.5, so medium effect size. How good were the habit formation plans? Well, around 93% targeted exactly one behavior. 85% of them used an event-based cue, so really, if this happens, then I'll do the action. And 93% were focused on increasing as opposed to stopping behavior. So quite good overall. And then some of the most common plans were, if I have handouts, I ask them to come pick it up from the desk. That one really was quite a popular one. At the beginning of each lesson, so a clear time, I encourage the students to use the physical activity equipment, so the desks or the sitting balls and things. Or if I notice students getting restless, then I'll have an activity break. So pretty good. Now, how often did the teachers actually utilize these plans? 7 of the teachers used them regularly, so around 15%, used it at least once in every 4 lessons. But 17 teachers, around 40%, did not use the habit formation techniques at all. So that leaves around half of the people who used it once or a few times in the 2 weeks period. So, meh, not great, but 60% were using some habit formation techniques at least. We then wanted to explore a little bit further the mechanisms behind this intervention. So, did these intervention mechanisms actually hold? Now, we conducted a few mediation analyses to try to find out. So the first model we tested looked at whether changes in reasoned action approach variables based on the intervention or following from the intervention led to increases in intention. And we found that these pathways were significant and that descriptive norms mediated the relationship between intervention receipt and intention. So descriptive norms and intention seems to be an important link. We then looked at whether the intervention increased intention and whether intention then led to use of behavior change techniques like action planning or goal setting more often. And we found these relationships and again a significant mediation indicating that greater intentions led to greater use of behavior change techniques. And then we looked at whether the intervention affected behavior change techniques and intentions and in addition self-efficacy in 2 different ways. We actually had 2 measures of active teaching. One was whether the teachers introduced sitting breaks, so that would be model number 4 that I'll show. But model number 3 was looking at the overall amount of strategies that they used to reduce sitting. And in model number 3, we showed this pattern and a significant mediation of self-efficacy. So self-efficacy seemed really important to the number of overall strategies that people were reporting using in their classrooms. And looking at the sitting breaks, the behavior change techniques, so making action plans and setting goals related to introducing sitting breaks seemed to be the most important predictor of that. So overall, this study was sort of a convenience study. We couldn't actually randomize the teachers because we had powered the entire trial based on the number of students that we wanted to include. And so we had far fewer teachers, and therefore far less power to identify effects. And the habit formation elements were only included after the feasibility study. They weren't in there from the beginning. They were added to help teachers try to automatize this. And we didn't have as much time to optimize these habit formation procedures as we would have liked. So that might explain the less than ideal uptake. And one big problem is that only half of the teachers completed all of the workshops. So there was some dropout, there were scheduling conflicts, which meant that some teachers couldn't attend. And we tried really to get all teachers involved, but it wasn't as easy as we thought. And so this response bias might influence these results. But in summary, the intervention teachers more frequently introduced breaks to student sitting, and the habit formation plans that they made in the sessions were of pretty high quality. They didn't use them quite as frequently as we would have liked. And the differences between groups in this active teaching was explained by descriptive norms, intention, and behavior change technique enactment. So if you're interested in reading more and more detail about this particular study, or about the teacher intervention as a whole, there's some copies of this article over there on the table, and never mind the typo. And thanks a lot to Katarina Kouka, who carried out much of this work, as well as Nelli and the rest of the team there. So, thanks a lot. If there are. Skip it.
Thank you, Keegan, very much. Let's go on to qualitative process evaluation for the student program. So we also had actually qualitative interviews as focus groups, and Nora Hagman wrote a master's thesis on that, but we won't go into the teacher program qualitative evaluation now. So students, we wanted to interview a subsample of students in the trial arms, so both intervention schools and control schools, And we purposefully sampled students that were in the age group of 15 to 19 and that had reported low levels of physical activity at baseline, because those were the ones that we were interested in the whole time. And we also purposefully selected to have in the interviews both those students who had increased physical activity from baseline to post-intervention measures, and those who had decreased or maintained their physical activity, just to make sure we have a variety of changes or maintenance there in the interviews. So to remind you of these slides, there is fidelity beyond delivery, so provider-delivered intervention must be well received, understood for the effects of the intervention to come. So in one of the currently ongoing studies, we are looking at participant receipt and enactment based on these interviews. So Minttu Palsola has been analyzing the interviews of the intervention arm students, looking at whether youth demonstrate comprehension of the intervention or whether there are misunderstandings, and to what extent they perceive being able to enact the skills that they learned, the behavior change techniques, and what problems there are. And we hope that these findings could then help us understand behavior change processes better, feeding back to theories, as well as then help practical optimization of similar programs. So here is just one in-progress overview of main themes identified in the student interview. So there is the green section, so some themes that would demonstrate correct understandings or intended understandings of the intervention messages, and then the red section shows some misunderstandings. Very, very interesting stuff overall. And just some examples of these themes that have been identified. So, for example, this idea of graded tasks, gradual goal setting. There was one indication of, or several indications of that. So, for example, this participant said that I learned that you don't have to be afraid, that it's not only after one night, but that the achievement will come just little by little. And another theme, unfortunately, a misunderstanding, contrary to the intervention's original purpose, which we thought that the students would get the message that these skills will be helpful for them in life, and not only in school. But then some interviewees showed this kind of misunderstanding that I just thought that let's move it, it's some course. I didn't think that I would start using this then. So of course this is not what we would optimally like. So there is still another sub-study using the qualitative interviews, which is focusing on the mechanisms of impact and what the students themselves attribute changes in their physical activity to. And we asked in this sub-study what critical incidents do the students themselves identify to be the key to changes in their physical activity behavior or thoughts. And PhD candidate Katri Kostamo has been doing this analysis, applying the critical incidents technique to these interventions and interviews. And what is really nice about the critical incident techniques that it's kind of a conservative analytical strategy compared to thematic analysis or content analysis of qualitative interviews, in that it requires that the interviewee themselves link in their talk the critical incident to be a crucial driver of the change that they are making. So that's why we are really fascinated by these analyses that haven't been actually used in intervention process evaluation in this context very much before. So here's an overview of the coded critical incidents. In intervention arm interviewees, they identified 23 critical incidents associated with the Let's Move It intervention relevant to their physical activity increase, and then 8 other issues or causes, and also control arm interviewees identified 8 causes to their physical activity changes. So just some examples here. So the critical incidents linked with the Let's Move It intervention were categorized into three large categories. The first being that the intervention provided knowledge on physical activity and sitting. So creating a new understanding of physical activity, new knowledge of physical activity benefits and disadvantages of sitting. So for example, this participant says that in the Let's Move It, the instructor said that a little plus is, even a little bit of physical activity is a plus. So it has given me a huge amount of motivation, that thing. So linking back to the Let's Move It principles of adding any movement is better than nothing. It's clearly something that's come out there. And also, one participant said, although I did subconsciously know that physical activity is kind of like also simple daily activities, I never thought of that like that until someone said it to me. So basically really making them realize the opportunities that they can grab in their daily life seem to speak to them. And also in this quote, I think also you can see that this adding little activity, even little bit of physical activity is better than nothing, has brought this person to understand that physical activity doesn't sound so disgusting to me any longer. Critical incidents category 2 intervention was found to provide novel skills for activity, so really practical tips for physical activity increase and maintenance, and sitting reduction, and then adopting self-regulation procedures. And third category, gaining insight into own behavior, a perception of freedom to make one's own choices, and becoming aware of one's own sitting behavior. So here is one example focusing on the red bits, that it is not like that we come from an angle where we try to get everyone to exercise and go to the gym, but that you can do small things and they will show us that it is our option whether we do or won't, that they won't judge. So this is really reflects quite well the autonomy supportive and motivational style of the whole intervention, because there was no aggressive pressuring into exercising. So there were also some interesting indications that are relevant to trial, so mere measurement effects in the interviews. So one participant mentioned trial body composition measurement had helped them understand that muscles and fat in one's body might be affected by physical activity. And one participant said that accelerometer wearing had inspired them to be on the move more than usually, that it would show something else than zeros. So this is kind of shedding or casting a shadow on the reliability of the physical activity measures, whether they actually reflect their true daily activities. And a control participant said that survey answering and accelerometer wearing had made her think about reasons for physical activity. So, of course, interesting things. And also other critical incidents in both arms, because real-life trials do not occur in vacuum. So quite usual physical activity drivers that other studies have identified, like seasonal change or life events, were identified in the interviews as well. So the students identified some of the key drivers, for example, outcome expectations, autonomy support, self-efficacy skills. What was quite interesting, that environmental changes were not really that salient in the interviews, but it is not unusual because people, of course, don't have access to knowledge of what things drive their behavior, and perhaps those things closer to their person might be then more salient to their knowledge. But to introduce the bridge to the next talk, I remind you of this sad fact that less than 50% of intervention participants in our feasibility study used key self-regulation behavior change techniques. And also in our baseline data from the RCT, we can see that the distribution of people, how they respond to using BCTs. For some BCTs, like reminding self of positive consequences, is quite equal, so there are respondents in all categories, and many people think of relevance of physical activity. But here you see the tallest column is actually respondents who say that they haven't sought social support for physical activity, and also most usual answer on this is that they have not monitored physical activity on their smartphone. And so reflecting this idea that many people don't take up the behavior change techniques that they are recommended, I'm guilty of that myself. This is a physical activity self-monitoring diary, really nice looking one that was given by my child's school like almost 2 years ago. It's on our fridge door, and I still haven't logged our family's physical activities on that, even though I know it might be useful. So it's really interesting, especially in the intervention context, to dig deeper into different views of people. Why don't they use these self-regulation strategies after the interventions? And now our next speaker, postdoctoral researcher Elina Renko, will tell you what our interviewees in the Let's Move It RCT told about one self-regulation strategy, namely planning. Why? You can stand up.
Yeah. Hey. So thank you so much. It's nice to be here today. As Nelli said, I will go a little bit deeper to one behavior change technique, namely planning. And I will look a little bit more in detail about students' reasons that they gave for planning and not planning physical activity. And this is actually just a new study that we started just, 1 month ago. So the results are quite new and still like work in progress in a way. But I will start from this slide because this question about planning and not planning actually is based on our data. And what we did was that we analyzed Let's Move It process evaluation follow-up interviews. And now I'm talking about the interviews that were done 14 months post-baseline. And altogether we had 19 interviews from practical nurse students, hotel, restaurant and catering students, and both from intervention schools, 14 interviews from there, and then from control schools we had 5 interviews. And all of these students were the ones who reported low physical activity at baseline. And this is already familiar picture to you. Nelli showed it before. And here it's just, I have it here because I want to emphasize that now we are concentrating on this part. So self-regulation and for especially planning here. And what we asked when we were analyzing the data was, first of all, that what self-regulation techniques the students report using. And we did content analysis on this and formed 3 subgroups that were active cognitive planning using daily habits and rhythm, and then strengthening social support. So those were the first categories that we had. But then we found out something interesting, namely that the analysis revealed that the comments about planning were really contradictory. And this meant basically that the same interviewee could tell, on the other hand, that he or she is doing quite like precise planning, and then, on the other hand, that she or he doesn't actually plan at all later in the interview, or other way around. And we got interested in this and did content analysis, again, with the question that we, in order to explore the reasons that the vocational school students then give for planning or not planning physical activity. So this is the question, the main question of the study I want to talk about now. But first, a little bit about the background and the definition of planning. It's not easy task to define planning, and it has been defined in many ways, depending on theoretical and epistemological standpoints and different paradigms on the field. One definition that I want to present here is the one that, in a way, separates planning from implementation intentions. And in this definition, planning means something that is to attain goals, and then implementation intentions are, in a way, a specific form of planning that then specify a critical condition that is linked to this goal-directed response. And actually, Keegan already talked about this before. And then another definition of planning I want to present here comes from behavior change technique taxonomy. And their action planning is defined as detailed planning of performance of the behavior, and as something that must include at least one of those things of context, frequency, duration, and intensity. And this kind of definition of planning, it includes both this generic definition of planning and implementation intention, so both of them are there. All in all, planning is a prospective technique, and it has been shown that planning, together with self-efficacy, may facilitate to bridge intention-behavior gap. So that way it's really important. And implementation intentions and action planning are actually the two of the most recognized and often applied planning techniques to change health behavior. Now I have here something that is supposed to demonstrate how planning was promoted during Let's Move It intervention. Actually, Nelli already talked about this quite a lot. And one of the central things here was the use of smart goal setting and smart planning. And this slide is in Finnish. It's the one that has been used during the Let's Move It intervention sessions, and I will briefly explain what it includes. The idea here is that there can be different kinds of goals. There is a goal of Anni and goal of Jenna. And Anni's goal is quite unspecific. So she says in a way that she wants to do more physical activity, but she doesn't know quite how or like when she would have time for it. And then on the other hand, there is a Jenna's goal that is more specific, and it details like when she would do more physical activity and with whom and where. And during the Let's Move It sessions, the project coordinator of Let's Move It was asking from the students what do they think about those goals, and they had discussion about it, and the students were thinking if the goals of Jenna and Anni are possible to reach, if they are possible to measure, if they are timely or relevant or detailed enough. So this is basically what smart planning includes, and the whole idea is that through this kind of planning you can make more like general goals to be like more detailed plans. And we also had in Let's Move It student workbook quite many exercises that were related to this smart planning. There is one example where students were supposed to think about like what kind of physical activity would they like to do, why and where, and with whom and when. Altogether, planning is quite important and interesting strategy to use in interventions, and that's why it's important to ask like how we can then best increase the uptake and use of planning. And this is an interesting question because it leads us to think about planning as a behavioral target in itself. And this is what we did now in this our new study that I will now present. So why and why not did vocational school students say that they would use planning to increase their physical activity? As I said, we did content analysis on this, and after that we formed 3 categories for why to plan, and then 4 categories for why not to plan. And I will first go through those why to plan categories. So the first one was that when there is a plan, one knows what to do, and then also must stick to the plan. There is one student who says here, it goes much easier. I don't have to start thinking on the spot, what should I do? And then another student who says that when you have made an agreement with yourself or with whoever you are going with, then you just have to go. And in this category, social dimensions of planning were highlighted. So basically, this meant that students reported that if a plan has been made together, it also must be followed for the sake of others. And as one student says here, I have somebody to remind me that, hey, today is the thing. And if I plan alone, then it's easier to fail to go because I don't really feel like it. Then the second category for why to plan was that planning could strengthen the sense of control over one's physical activity and give, in a way, a sense of progress and ability. There is one citation from the student that describes this quite well. It says, I have different kinds of days, like they can be, for example, a leg day, a stomach day, or upper body day, or cardio, so that you are training your whole body depending on what kind of day it is. And then the third and last category for why to plan was that the self-made plan could actually strengthen the feeling of autonomy. So in a way, you feel I decide myself how I move, and then also have power to modify the plan if it feels necessary. As one student says here, so I can divert a little from the plan or change what I do. I scaled down a bit the routines that I used to do, so I still have energy to go to work. And then to summarize the story so far, so the main reasons for planning were that the plan helps to clarify what to do, to stick with it, strengthen the feeling of autonomy, and then also a sense of progress, ability, and control. So 10 reasons for not planning are the next categories I will present here. So the first reason for not to plan was that the plan may start to feel forced or like a duty. And as one student says here, it's not fun if you always plan the stuff to the end, as if it was in school or at work. And they turn to be obligations. You are forced to fulfill them, and it takes all the fun out of it. The second category is quite related to the first one, actually, quite closely. here the students reported that the plan takes away the freedom in decision making, in a way, as if the plan would force an order from above somehow. So I get the feeling that I really need to do it, and sometimes that even brings me anxiety. And as other student says, if I go skating, I do what I like to do. It's not like that now I will do sprints between the lines for 10 minutes. So it was this kind of like wanting to be spontaneous and free that was like, in a way, something that the plan was attacked to. And then the third category was that if the plane fails for some reason, then it would result bad mood. And this was one reason for not making plans at all then. So if you make one and fail to follow it, it will just make you feel bad. And if I'm not there doing those things at the time, that kind of makes me annoyed. Then you feel kind of like that I failed. Then the fourth and the last category for not planning was that the planning was thought to be to work for others maybe, but not for me, because I'm not really a planner type of person. So as the student says here, I'm really not just that kind of type that I like to do everything bit extempore. And it's also easier to think like that, hey, let's do this, let's do that. And then it's easier to make it happen, in my opinion. In this category, it was quite usual that it was highlighted that planning would be maybe more suitable for athletes who train seriously. And but if you are just one who likes to walk or go to gym every now and then, you just go if you feel like going. And as one student says here, since I do not train in a proper team or anything, it's not so serious or anything, and that's why I don't like to plan anything. So the main reasons for not planning then were that the plan may feel forced or like a duty, that that would take away the freedom, and if it fails, it results bad mood, and it might work for others, but not for me. And it was really interesting that we had these categories that emerged, because in Let's Move It, the planning was promoted in a way that you are free to make your own plan, and there can be different kinds of plan, and you can be different kind of planner. So, but still, from the talk of the students, it was possible to find these categories. And these categories for planning and not planning were actually similar, both in the intervention arm and control arm. Then just one more small thing that was interesting, that was that even if the students would say that they don't actually like to plan themselves at all, then they could still say that they would maybe still like to do sometimes small plans or like step-by-step planning. One student says here that I have noticed ages ago, like years ago, that for me the precise plans do not really work. Like they fail like after a minute or so already. So I like to make like a small plan. And actually this student was one who was describing that she is actually planning quite a lot and doing quite like detailed plans, but she was considered those being like a small plans and not like a real plans in a way. And then as other students says, if it's something lighter, then I can plan it, like that on Saturday I will go for a long walk with my dog or something like that. or I will ask my mom to go with me. Those kind of things I might plan ahead. So this was interesting because this is really like goes along with the definition of planning. This is something that could be considered as planning, but somehow the participants thought that it's not real plan, it's more like a lighter or small kind of planning. So then to conclude, what do the results tell about how then to promote the uptake of planning and use of planning? It's important to note, first of all, that planning may affect not only like abilities and control of behavior, but also the feeling of ability and autonomy experienced on various ways. And to promote planning then, it might be good to challenge non-planner identity, to note that there can be different kinds of plans and planners as well, and also highlight the importance of flexible step-by-step planning. And third thing, also to include planning components to promote self-efficacy. That's it. So thank you.
Okay, if you don't have any questions for Elina, we can move on to the next phase. My name is Matti Heino. I'm not that much going to talk about actual results, but more of a conceptual framework that we've been developing here, and when we have been thinking about how to actually model and consider these intervention processes that take place when we do a complex intervention in a highly complex system like a school where a lot of things are going on at the same time. So first of all, how do we evaluate intervention processes? So what leads to what, and how the processes of how change actually takes place? To answer that question, let's think about how we evaluate intervention efficacy or efficiency. We have a quite easy-ish framework for this. When we say that something worked, we basically mean that we have a predicted change in a pre-specified outcome, and this is of course in quantitative studies. So we have physical activity and sedentary behavior, and if these change, they change, and if they don't, they don't. And this is easy stuff, right? Well, Nelli is going to later tell you that it's not that easy, but compared to looking at the processes, it is actually quite simple. And one of the things that we need to consider is that when we talk about how something worked, how an intervention facilitated change, for example, we have this sort of a causal model in our heads or in the protocol, but this effect always is mediated by some black box that people like to talk about. And often what people want to do in science, what they want to do is they want to open these black boxes, and when you do that, sometimes something very complicated pops out. And to study something like this, how a process took place, has some particular problems that we don't have when we just want to evaluate a simple impact of A to B. For example, we can't randomize these links between the hypothesized mediators or the processes that take place. And well, it's still not rocket science, but I'm going to argue that it's worse than rocket science. And there are some very curious properties of these behavior change interventions that we need to be taking into account when we evaluated them. So if we look at the moonshot, you you build a rocket, you have a huge project, you land it to the moon, and you can do this with the technology that you had 50 years ago. Well, if you compare it to a behavior change intervention, first of all, you have the rocket and the atmosphere affects the rocket in one direction. The rocket rarely changes the atmosphere itself in unpredictable ways, whereas for behavior change interventions, we have people who affect their peer groups, and their peer groups affect their people back, and also the peer groups change the school environments and all the other groups that they're part of. So all of this is constantly changing. And the rocket operates in a relatively stable environment. We can have maybe storms coming, which we can quite well predict so that we won't be timing our launch to a day when there's a big storm. But in a behavior change intervention, you have the context, for example, a school that is changing all the time, and the funding system that may also change and constrain the resources you have. Or the schools may change their criteria of intake, so you end up with some people who don't speak Finnish, for example, which can be problematic if you want them to fill out 50+ questions in Finnish in a survey questionnaire. And the physics, the laws, they're basically unchanging in the short time scales of less than a few million years. And whereas in behavior change intervention, the processes may change, and what makes a person or a group of people change can actually change itself. So what makes a person change at time A doesn't necessarily work anymore in time B. And so these processes can switch. And also, if you don't leave your rocket out in the rain in a silo for many decades, they're likely going to stay relatively the same. And the rockets are going to be like other rockets, and you can learn from their behavior to extrapolate into future rocket building. Whereas in behavior change interventions, we have people who differ from each other, but they also differ during their life course. And their history matters in how well they will be receiving the intervention. And this has some curious consequences that we're going to talk about. But first of all, this actually matters because we have some evidence that taking into account principles from complexity science, which is something that started out in physics but has spread throughout different fields of science. And you can apparently, well, some initial evidence states that you can improve intervention outcomes if you actually start taking these things into account. And in public health, these complexity principles, so to say, have been talked about for quite a while. There's a good review paper if you want to see that. And also, I forgot to say that in this address here, you have these slides already. I don't know when they're going to put them up in the Tiedekulma, but you have some extra slides and all the materials, and you can follow the links that I have here when you get to the slides. Right. So also, schools have been considered as complex systems, and there are many good reasons to do that. And if you want to read more, you can check back to those papers. But before we go on, we need to take a small detour into systems thinking. So a system is a delineated part of the universe, which is distinguished by some imaginary boundary from the rest of the universe. And in some social systems, this is a more open boundary than in others. And we can think of a rocket as a system that has subsystems, such as a propulsion system. We have a person which has subsystems like a circulatory system. You can think of schools as systems and intervention arms as systems, and it brings quite a different perspective on what you think is going to go on in the intervention when you are designing it or evaluating it. So here you have one person who is part of this group of peers in their own neighborhood, or this group of peers who go and play football with, and this group of peers who are in their school, for example. And they are interacting with these other groups, and the groups are changing as a result of those interactions. And what unifies these three systems is that they have many parts which interact with each other, and if you press here, you don't always get the same thing coming out of here. So if you give the same input, you don't consistently get the same output, which is really, really annoying if you want to do something that seems like an engineering sort of straightforward intervention development. So what we have is complex systems. And interventions can be thought of as events taking place in these systems. So you have a system like a school, you bring in the intervention, and what you try to do is wiggle the school system and have it change have the intervention bring some sort of a lasting change, so that you need to wiggle the system enough so that the footprint of the intervention doesn't just wash off the moment you remove it. And these complex systems where you bring the intervention into, they have some general features that may help in thinking about what sorts of interventions should and could work in them. And one of those is feedback loops. This is a systems map of a type 2 diabetes system, which includes environmental features and cognitive features, and basically everything. But what you can see here is that you have a lot of feedback loops which can reinforce each other or control the system. You can also think about this within a person, to simplify a bit. So above you have the slower timescale processes, and below you have the faster or short-term timescale. And you have the person's knowledge and skills, for example, which defines or constrains or controls how the person is going to appraise things, evaluate things, which goals they will be creating. And this, again, is going to determine or control the actions and the interactions that the person is going to make in the short-term time scale. And when you do these actions or interactions, you have them, and this again affects the person's experience and learning in the slower time scale, which again leads to controlling the knowledge and the skills of the person. So you have the fast timescale processes which feed back through the slower timescale processes into the fast timescale processes. And this is not so simple to model as a straightforward A to B type of a classical randomized controlled trial. But you can see some examples of this process happening in, for example, how in the Let's Move It we considered the behavioral regulation cycle that Keegan also talked about. And another feature that we might want to take into account is self-organization and emergence. And this means that you have some micro-scale interactions that work on the fast time scales, and this can create longer timescale processes, which you end up seeing macro-scale organizations and things happening that are very hard to predict if you only look at the small time scales or the microscopic interactions between people. And we can take an example of the school staff. And in the Let's Move It, we tried to form school teams of the school staff so that we could have them take over the tailoring of the intervention and adapt the intervention to their own school context, come up and innovate new ways of dealing with inactivity. But looking back, a big problem was that the school staff was already working at their limits. And this is an interesting feature of the whole school system and also the general view on how we want things to be efficient. So we try to reduce redundancies in the systems, and people don't have time to take anything extra. So what often happens in situations like this is that when something unexpected happens, a lot of things start breaking down. Another feature of complex systems, we have a co-evolution of the system and its environment. And this means that whatever system you have, it changes with the environment, and the environment changes with the system. So if we think of the supply and demand of physical activity facilities, as Nelli mentioned, we tried to have schools open their gyms to students more with better opening hours and all that, but we also tried to have the local gym providers and physical activity facility providers to offer discounts for students. So what we hoped to see was that we would have an emerging market for these gyms, so that they would start getting, as the social norms would start changing, they would have a new consumer niche that they could target, and we would have a win-win situation where people would actually start using these services and become more active, and these services would become more available to them, and the gyms would end up having more customers. In retrospect, this was a bit hard to actually convince the gyms, and perhaps if we went on and did this again, we might put more efforts into doing that. And we also have path dependence and adjacent possibilities. So what this means is that the history, as I said, matters. So if you come to be in a certain place in terms of your activity, it doesn't only matter how active you are now, it also matters how active you've been in the past and what kinds of childhood experiences you've had and all that. And this is, of course, self-evident for practitioners, but sometimes as scientists, as researchers, we tend to forget all the nuances that take place in these sorts of processes. So also so if we have the individual participant as an example system, in the Let's Move It, we try to have them not give them something that, so here are the recommendations or things you should be doing, but have them self-tailor the goals they have and attempt to try out new forms of physical activity that they felt comfortable with. And in retrospect, we think that this is a very vital component of interventions because you rarely can have a very good view of a very heterogeneous group of people and what actually makes them tick. And the adjacent possibilities here means that every person has a certain space of activity or things that they can try out, or how much they can improve their physical activity, and this is dependent on their previous physical activity and their current physical activity. And just a few words about conceptualizing these complex systems and modeling them. One of the things that we can use is network analysis, and social network analysis has been underused for many decades now, but nowadays we can also do psychological network analysis where we try to figure out the connections of different things and model them as a mutually reinforcing network. I'll show you an example soon, but first, so this is the behavior change techniques that we used, as Nelli also already mentioned. So we had the behavior change techniques that related to motivation, that related to behavioral regulation and social norms or social facets of their lives. And yeah, so I'll just show you this. So basically what you can see here is a network of behavior change techniques which are in green and which are connected to each other, and motivational nodes which are those in yellow. And we also have the moderate to vigorous physical activity up there. Oops. And what you can see from this is that we have some, that the techniques, okay. Yeah, you can't probably see this, but you have some self-regulatory techniques, you have some motivational techniques, the social ones cluster here. But one thing you can also see is that these techniques are mainly connected to physical activity by autonomous motivation. So the only things that are not connected to physical activity through autonomous motivation is trying out new ways of physical activity and having a plan made by someone else. So if you would think of this as a hypothesis generating exploratory analysis, you might want to say that, okay, so if a person is active but is not autonomously motivated, then they either have been trying out new ways of physical activity or have a plan made by someone else. And this is something that already came up, that that there was this one person who said that if they have arranged a plan with their friend or something, they don't need to be that motivated to go, you just go because you have promised the other person that you go. And so having a plan made by someone else might also mean that you are part of a sports team, for example, or a group of football players or something, that you have a stable schedule for exercise. Just to summarize, so this isn't rocket science, and we could solve a lot of these things so much easier if it was rocket science, but we might want to take into account some things that are inherent in these systems that we operate in, and not just try to simplify them into something that starts conflicting with reality too much. And just a few conclusions. I would say that we need to recognize the different facets of complexity and how they affect what we're trying to do. This has implications for how you design interventions and how you evaluate them. And once you start opening these black boxes of processes, it might be a bit hard to go back to the simple A to B causal thinking, so be mindful of that. And to evaluate something, you need many strands of inquiry, because you just can't find out many things. For example, emerging norms or emerging new so-called these weak signals that start taking place in schools and so on. You can't find those out if you only go by this A to B causal thinking. And if you want to think about evaluation even further, you might want to look at the Bayesian approach, where you are not reliant on repeated frequencies of things, but you can update your view of what are the uncertainties inherent in this evaluation. And there's also one interesting paper about the economic evaluation of interventions which take place in complex systems. And you can find links for all of these things in my webpage and in the slides when they become available. But they are now available at mattiheino.com. So, thanks. We do have a few minutes, perhaps, if you have some questions. If not, I'll just give Nelli the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So, the main takeaway message from Matti's talk is that behavior change science is not rocket science. It's much more difficult than rocket science. All right, so moving on to the final talk of the evaluation part before Tommi Vasankari's commentary, and then moving on to the dissemination of the project. So I'll just give some insights of the analysis that we have made. So some process variables of motivational and behavioral variables, and then the accelerometry measured variables. So really looking at how do these variables change in the intervention and control arm. So descriptive norms, you can see the starting points there. There are actually consistently the intervention arm students report kind of more disadvantaged levels of these determinants, many of these determinants baseline. So basically they might not be completely similar schools that we're talking about. But looking at the changes, so descriptive norms, the only significant differences here are that descriptive norms, so the perception of how much other people are active, this is lower in intervention schools, and in both arms this perception lowers by the 14-month follow-up, which might simply reflect the fact that we know that during teenage years physical activity declines, so people drop out from organized sports. Also then behavior change technique use, which has been one of our key interests. So there we have an interaction effect in time and arm. So intervention arm students take up more behavior change techniques by the first follow-up after the intensive intervention. But then what is quite typical in long-term follow-ups, this effect fades away by the long-term follow-up. And then another measure of behavior change technique use among students. So again, intervention school students start off a bit lower, but by the first follow-up, they have increased their the use of behavior change techniques more than the control arm schools. But again, by the one-year follow-up, it doesn't seem to show any differences. And then autonomous motivation, the final process measure I will present here. This, as you see, it actually is quite high already at baseline. It might be because the target behavior that we link the autonomous motivation in the questionnaire to is not that difficult to reach. But basically, it looks like the intervention arm kind of catches up with the control arm, but this effect is not statistically significant, so it doesn't change in either of the groups. But let's look on average. So this is of course very boring to look at kind of the on average effects. We are digging deeper into kind of what kind of change clusters there might occur in both of the arms. Accelerometry results. So remember the small UKK Institute's excellent small device that the youth were wearing. So here we have analysis from the UKK Institute, collaborator in these analysis. So the passive time, the total time spent in sedentary activities, decreases during school days, but again, by 1 year follow-up, this effect fades away. There are no differences in breaking sedentary behavior, so very negligible effects. And then and also for the third outcome, main primary outcome, moderate to vigorous physical activity, there are no significant differences between intervention and control arm. Contrary to that then, light physical activity increases during the weekdays, and also especially during school days. So there is a 13-minute daily difference in light physical activity after the intensive intervention. But by time 4, so 14 months, again, this different decreases. We are thinking this might reflect the fact that the teachers at T3 still do classroom activation strategies, but they stop doing it by the T4, or that the measures in the 14-month follow-up, many of the students were actually distance learning periods at home and not in school premises. So praising these results, so there were no effects in the co-primary outcomes of sedentary behavior and moderate to vigorous physical activity. And comparison to previous studies, this was perfectly in line with them. Also, the slight change in light physical activity fades away by the long-term follow-up. Like you remember in our systematic review, none of the previous trials had shown long-term effects. So concluding that behavior change is actually difficult. Critical evaluation of the sample size. So we had actually targeted to recruit 1,400 students so that we would have at least 700 people in the post-dropout sample size. But these analyses actually include less than 300 people, and we don't know whether this dropout in those people who wore the accelerometer 4 days, 10 hours at least, that they were somehow different than the total arm, total sample. Comparability of the T4 follow-up, like I said, that people were not in the context of the school, so it doesn't capture actually what's happening in the schools themselves. And the validity of the measure does really a sample of 4 to 7 days of accelerometry adequately represent one's physical activity behavior. It also, this accelerometer excludes any water sports and martial arts and so forth. But still, it's the state-of-the-art measurement of physical activity. And before I kind of was involved in this study, I didn't really realize how difficult it is to measure physical activity reliably, and so many questions have arisen here. But we could hope that perhaps same bias in the validity of measurements could be present in both arms, because we have a randomized design. So focusing again on the effects of the moderate to rigorous physical activity and discussion, what kind of interpretations we could draw from this, what kind of conclusions we can draw, what we can learn. So one conclusion could be that the program theory was wrong, that targeting these determinants won't help, and they do not provide sufficient effective mechanisms for physical activity change. Another idea could be that the program theory was correct, but fidelity to intervention was low. For example, less than 50% of the teachers participated in the workshops. Okay, actually that wasn't targeting the MBPA so much. But, for example, the home workout videos, many of the youth didn't even enter the website of the intervention. And then what we found also as a risk already in the feasibility study phase, that between session physical activity experiments were not done by students. So as a hindsight, we could have embedded the whole course in a physical education course where they alternate between these cognitive motivational discussion tasks and physical activities, and again, a new session and so on. So That was actually done in the dissemination phase as a one. And then, furthermore, program theory maybe was correct, but the dose was too low. So as for vitamin D supplements, you have to have enough of the vitamin D to get the health benefits for that. The same for this. So reviews show that more intensive and longer interventions are in fact more effective in producing behavior change. So even if right things were done in the sessions, these few hours is perhaps rarely sufficient to teach behavior change. And even if you think more affluent, more acutely ill people who hire personal trainers for themselves, individualized feedback and guidance, still that is oftentimes insufficient to produce changes. And also external disturbances to the systems during the trial. So they were the biggest budget cuts ever to the educational systems, with teachers being, or school staff being laid off at the same time of our trial conduct, and change in student admission. So when I wrote the original project proposal and talked to school staff back then, so still at those times schools could select students, so they could require that they could Finnish language, for example, that there were Finnish language tests. But later on, the governmental changes changed the policies so that we had classrooms of people who actually couldn't perhaps understand Finnish very fluently, and then attending these student sessions might not be so very useful if you don't know what's going on. So these kind of things might also explain inefficacy. Also, some people have asked that why don't you measure, like after 5 years, whether there are differences between the intervention arm and control arm, because basically what this program teaches is skills and tips on how to get active, changing the physical activity relationship, understanding of physical activity and how to self-regulate, and perhaps students, when they enter young adulthood, may be more able to take up physical activity then, due to the Let's Move It program. But I was just perhaps too tired to design yet another follow-up study for the whole program, but that's also one alternative explanation. Also, furthermore, the program theory could have been right for physical activity change, but not for physical activity maintenance. And like I said in the first talk, we had to make these painful decisions, and realizing that we really had very short slots and couldn't include maintenance, behavior change maintenance activities as much as we would have hoped for. Also, some parts of the program theory might have been correct, and some might have been wrong. So this is quite interesting commentary paper by Gene Adams and colleagues, positing that some population interventions for diet and obesity might be more equitable and effective because they don't require so much individual agency. So basically, lower socioeconomic groups might benefit from interventions that don't require so much agency. So here I have they have these 2 dimensions. So some interventions don't require much individual agency for the person to benefit from the intervention, and then the other dimension is the population versus high-risk target of the intervention. So ours, of course, was directed at basically the whole cohort reached in the schools, so that's not relevant. But for example, this sitting reduction and activity breaks in classrooms, that's actually something that doesn't require very much agency from the students themselves. They just, do what, the teachers introduces in the classrooms, and they go on to doing the light activities. But for example, the group program for students and using school facilities, using the home workout videos, these are things that actually require quite a bit of agency. Well, attending the group program doesn't, because that's incorporated to be part of the school, and we had quite high reach and fidelity, relatively high fidelity of students attending at least 4 sessions out of the 6. But still then going on and using the behavior change techniques is something that is actually quite agentic. So basically, making healthy choices easy, like in the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion in '86, many years ago already, that is the most equitable public health strategy. The problem is, of course, that how do we create environments that nudge people into moderate to vigorous physical activity? That's much more harder than producing environments conducive to light physical activities and less sedentary behavior. So discussion going on, changes were mainly in light physical activity. Why is this? So I have this sore memory of our very wise steering group member, Tommi Vasankari, who is out next. I remember before we started recruitment, in one of the steering group meetings, Tommi was reviewing the intervention content and saying that actually these intervention materials might be more likely to introduce changes in light physical activity than moderate to rigorous physical activity. And I was like, well, we have been focusing on moderate to vigorous physical activity in our review and in our development work. And is it okay to change kind of a co-primary outcome of a trial at this stage? But I kind of remember that comment that Tommi kind of predicted these results already then. Also that physical activity is a continuum, and so ranging from sedentary behavior to light activities, moderate and vigorous. So there can be some compensation at play. So if youth increased light physical activity during their school hours, perhaps they thought, even though they were motivated to be physically active, perhaps they perceived no need to do additional MVPA in their leisure time, and a kind of compensation happened there. And there's also interesting discordance between some process evaluation sub-studies that we can evidence various insights in the qualitative interviews, but not so much change in quantitative psychological measures on average. But these are, again, average numbers, and we will reveal, I think, much stuff during this year and the future years in digging deeper into those measures. So we will be looking at fidelity of different intervention components, because this is a multi-component, multi-level intervention, of course. We will be looking at different pathways to change or non-change subgroups within the trial cohort. We will triangulate findings regarding trial experiences in teachers and students. So thank you, Juha Vainio Foundation, for providing additional funding to conduct triangulation. And then understanding Let's Move It trial from complex systems perspective. And this is just to again mention that the datasets will be available to use. We have much more stuff that we were able to tell about the evaluation in the research articles that we are happy to send to you. There's a list of the outputs so far. And of course, then the intervention materials available freely on the website that have been optimized. And Elina will talk more about that. But thank you so far for your attention again, and let's invite Professor Tommi Vasankari to give the next commentary.
Thank you, Nelli. Nice presentation. Don't go far, because I might ask something. I am biased also, so I'm not a real commentator or competitor in here, because I'm also involved in the study. But let's start with the ideas. Which kind of effects could you expect? We are talking about here lifestyle change. Could you actually succeed if you don't get a certain type of differences in the actual lifestyle? I think that you can, and then it might be so that regardless of those minutes, how many minutes physical activity has increased or sedentary behavior decreased, you actually might have succeed. Well, I'm a medical doctor, so I'm not a specialist on that field, but in our field, one could say that yes, the surgery was success, but patient died. So you understand that there is something to succeed also, although something terrible would happen, you don't get certain type of outcome to change. which kind of magnitude is actually 13 or 14 minutes in this age group? I think it's a lot. We have been doing studies in working age population, in certain patient groups like cardiovascular patients, diabetics, and also children. Based on those, the best for adults have usually seen something like 30-minute increase in measured, usually light physical activity in adults. So based on that, I think that those results that Nelli just show us, they are pretty good. And one must underline, usually you might also face the fact that anything does not change. And in this age group, I suppose that most of us, all of us have actually faced that age group in ourselves. We know that during that age, so much is actually taking place in your life. So our intervention was a very, 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 very tiny one. So still, if that could change some 13 minutes extra in the light physical activity, although it might not last for 14 months, I think that it has clearly changed something. It could even be so, as we have seen in many, many lifestyle interventions, that those best results could be seen later on. I'm not telling that it must be also in our case, but it could be also in our case that if you get some knowledge that something that could actually change your behavior, it can take a time that could actually take place. But this too long comment means that actually I think that this pretty nice intervention, carefully designed intervention, actually succeed when it could actually show that the actually physical activity, light physical activity increased and the sedentary behavior does not change that much, but still there was measurable changes, and intervention like that, it means that yes, you get what you train for. Thanks.
Give a short, just brief commentary. So a physical activity for everyone intervention conducted in one of the European countries. So really these numbers and minutes that they showed, or was you maybe I'm not saying, maybe it was an Australian one, I'm sorry, but the thing is that in their intervention 3 minutes of moderate to vigorous daily activity was a successful result in kind of also clinically meaningful change in moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we are really talking about these even small numbers of activity might be clinically meaningful. All right, so our next and final speaker will go to talk about the final optimization phase and further development and then implementation into practice. So clearly, like we spoke to vocational school staff and teachers, they were really urging to get some materials. So how will I take up the issue of physical inactivity up with my students, and how will I address this? I need something to use in my physical education courses. And there was a large demand from the field for any materials. And now Elina will talk about what happened next.
Yeah, thanks. It's nice to be here again. So this will be our last presentation, as Nelli said, and I will briefly talk about how the best parts of Let's Move It have been then developed and disseminated in our Let's Move It key project. So as we have learned today, it's not easy to change system or organization. And this citation from Let's Move It teacher interview kind of describes this quite well. So it's difficult to change practices, and it might be difficult to get rid of thinking like we simply don't have time to have an activity break in our important meeting. And it is indeed a long way, because the evidence shows that typically it takes at least 2 years to successfully implement interventions in school organizations. Let's Move It was designed and optimized to be as lean and low cost as possible. And it only lasted for 6 weeks. Still, there were short-term increases in light physical activity and also some modification in beliefs and attitudes. And as we know that more intensive and longer interventions are more effective, it's interesting to think what would have happened if the students, if the youth would encounter the intervention contents and messages during the whole entire education and in all school context. As Nelli said already, it became clear already during Let's Move It that there is a high demand for materials to use in physical activity promotion in the physical education teaching. And luckily we got funding from Academy of Finland to tend to disseminate the best bits of Let's Move It in our key project that took place in 2017-2018. And what we did during our key project was that we developed and conducted 2 trainings and also some additional research-based materials. And we did this all together with our great collaborators that I wish to thank. And a special thank you goes here to Elisa Kaaja, who was really a key person of our key project and, for instance, conducted all of the trainings that we did. And I will go soon back to those trainings and materials a little bit more, but here I want to mention first that we also did research on our dissemination activities, and we researched how acceptable are or were the novel teacher trainings. Do teachers implement the interventions? Do they learn motivational interaction? And what are the challenges within? Then briefly about the trainings that we developed. The first one was training for in-service teachers. And it consisted on 2 parts. The first part was about Let's Move It, student sessions and teacher workshops. So basically, we taught teachers to further conduct the Let's Move It student sessions and teacher workshops in their schools. And then the second part that took place in another day was about motivational interaction. And both of the training parts took 4 hours. And altogether, almost 200 teachers participated in these trainings. We also did research on these trainings, and we analyzed, for example, how acceptable were the trainings. But I won't go to the details here. This is something that you already saw during the Nelli's presentation, but here the point is that we trained during the trainings the teachers to use motivational interaction, and this is something that supports autonomous motivation. So that was, in a way, the key point of the training, so one of the key points there. And this is the list of the motivational interaction techniques that we taught during the courses for teachers. All of those techniques are that kind of techniques that they can be applied to normal school lessons. Some of them, and often quite easily. For example, using non-controlling language could mean avoiding controlling language like should or got to or must, and using more motivating words instead of those. Our trainings got really positive feedback, and this is from our questionnaire. So participants who filled out the questionnaire after the training, over 90% of them would agree or completely agree with this statement. I would recommend this training to my colleagues. And almost 90% of the participants agreed that the training offered them tools to use Let's Move It program and materials with their students. And according to results that we got from the questionnaires, it seemed that most of the trained teachers had either fully or partly implemented the student program after 2 or 3 months the training. And then after 2 or 3 months, it seemed that the trainings had already reached over 6,000 students. And with the teacher workshops, most of the teachers, 2 to 3 months post-training, hadn't yet implemented the workshops, but they intended to start. And 1/3 of them had already fully or partly implemented the teacher workshops as well. We also asked about the main barriers for not implementing the student program or teacher workshops, and this is top 3 reasons for that. So the teacher told that other work tasks took too much time. It was maybe hard to find suitable time for teacher workshops, and also need for more support from colleagues was one of the reasons that was mentioned here. So that was our first training. Then very briefly about our second training. That was a university course on motivational interaction. And this was something that we did in University of Jyväskylä, and the participants were 35 pre-service PE teachers who studied at University of Jyväskylä. And the course took altogether 16 contact hours and some independent learning. And also this training got really positive feedback. There are some comments from the students here. And the students told that they got more confidence and also more tools and materials to use in their everyday life and also in the future work. We also studied this training and interview 19 participants who took the course and identified some benefits and challenges in using motivational techniques. And this study has already been submitted, and if you are more interested about it, you can find it from Open Science Framework. It's available there. Then third thing, besides the trainings, we also developed some other dissemination activities. And basically what they were presentations and trainings for Finnish sport and health sector actors. Our new Let's Move It website that contains material for promoting physical activity in schools. and training videos on motivational interaction style, and also half-day practical seminar here in Tiedekulma, actually, that was fully booked. So just to show you some examples, our website looks more or less like this, and it contains lots of materials, the best parts of Let's Move It for promoting physical activity in schools, and it's all free and available there, so it's a really useful resource for everyone who is interested in those materials. We have got already almost 10,000 visitors on the website. That is great, because our key audience were actually 200 vocational school PE teachers that exist in Finland. So it seems that many other groups have found our website already as well. Then I mentioned also those training videos on motivational interaction. They look more or less like this, and they have been also highly popular, and also they are freely available on YouTube to use and watch. Overall, all the dissemination activities we got gathered great feedback from different sources, and there is one citation from the participants of our motivational interaction course that says that the student wishes that the course would actually expand and be obligatory for all physical education teacher students, and he or she thinks that it's absolutely vital things that were learned there. And then there is other citation from visitor of our website who works as a personal trainer and finds all the materials great, and will also absolutely use them in his or her work. So I will end this presentation with one more citation from the student of our motivational interaction course. So here the student says, it happens often that in the end you start thinking, well, all the theory and research sounds very good, but how can I use it in practice? But on this course, I really felt that I actually got some tools to use in difficult situations. So, thank you. And I will invite Professor Taru Lintunen to give comments on our key project.
Mulla ei ole. Joo. Good afternoon. Thank you, Nelli and research group, for kind invitation. It's a pleasure to give comments on this excellent research project. I have to confess that I've been a fan of Let's Move It study from the very beginning, when I heard about this intervention study, because this is an excellent, really great intervention study, very well organized from the beginning, the planning phase, to the very end, dissemination of the results. And that's quite, needs a lot of skill, expertise, and that's what I have witnessed at all phases of the study. Very well organized study. A complex intervention. We heard earlier from Matti Heino's presentation what are complex interventions, systems approach, and this study has really needed that kind of vision to see how many different moving parts there are. I have to also confess that in the beginning I was a little bit skeptical how to really, first of all, get access to schools. Schools are not an easy place to get in and start doing intervention. For good reason, of course, not everybody should just walk in and start changing the system, the already also very complex system. Of course, the researchers were mainly from psychology, social psychology, and in the core research team there were no people from education, teacher training. So I was wondering whether they first of all get access there and how to deal with all the complex interventions that interactions that happen in schools. That was very, very wrong. Fortunately, I saw how stakeholders, representatives were invited to planning, and all phases of the study went according to guidebook. Schools were contacted, intervention was organized very smoothly in spite of all the challenges and obstacles like budget cuts at schools, changes in the school systems. This large-scale intervention was very, very well organized. And today we have seen first results, and results, of course, are true good results as such. We saw that light physical activity increased, and some discussion about what may be behind those results. This kind of intervention studies are still very rare. When Let's Move It project started, I think only 3 intervention studies had ever before been organized in Finland among children or youth to promote physical activity, at least according to report ordered of Ministry of Education, LANU report, Lasten ja Nuorten liikunta report. So it is quite challenging to do intervention research. So no wonder that there's not much more research done. And as we heard from Nelli Hankonen's presentation, currently there were only 10 previous studies before Let's Move It study. So this is not for everybody, I would say, to do this kind of study. And the low number illustrates how challenging it is to do interventions. This is a model example of a very well organized intervention study. And it is also, in addition to scientific results, it has produced material, trainings, as we just heard from Elina Renko's presentation. And there has been a high demand for material, exercise activities, trainings to increase physical activity, reduce sitting time, as one component of the intervention. And another one that's I see as important is the trainings to promote motivating interaction at schools. And that part is, I can see the opportunities, the possibilities with this part of training, how important it is and how much needed, not only in physical education, but in any education at any level of schools. Teachers need more skills to support autonomy of students, to use all those 7 different techniques we just saw to increase psychological well-being, open atmosphere, and students' participation. And I would like everybody to I would like to encourage everybody to utilize the materials which will be openly available or are already. Go to the websites, see all the materials. They are very useful, not only in physical education, but in many other areas of education, training, school life, university life. I highly recommend you to use and utilize those. What comes to acceptability and feasibility of the Let's Move It study, you just saw results how highly the participants cited and how good feedback they gave about the trainings. They really enjoyed. I've been involved with the training for students of physical education at the Faculty of Sport and Health Sciences, so I could witness how well the students received the training. Even though they had already had training on social interaction skills, training on pedagogical skills, but this added something that had been missing, went deeper. And I can see how useful this kind of training is in every teacher training. So I can highly recommend the trainings and also the materials. Of course, a challenge is how to integrate these trainings and contents to current teacher training, teacher education, curriculum, or in-service training of current teachers, PE teachers and other teachers. Because of all the budget cuts and too busy curricula, it's not easy to add something. You should always take something out before you can get something in, even if that something would be very, very useful and needed. That's a challenge. For example, universities are autonomous still. Teaching is, they have autonomy when it comes to how they create curriculum. So you should convince every teacher training unit, every university in Finland to include however good content it is, but you can't just, no one can order universities to change their training. So that's one of the challenges. And then, of course, at school level, we need booster sessions, longer interventions. Otherwise, the good effects fade away very easily. So that's Let's Move It project is a beginning, and I, with Nelli Hankonen and the research group, courage and strength to continue to keep important content, concepts, trainings, research going on. This is only the beginning. Even though this has been a major, major effort and huge work to do this kind of intervention study. This has been, thus far, a very successful project, and I wish luck in the future and congratulate Nelli and the research group for wonderful work. Thank you.
Just really quickly wrapping up the seminar. Thank you very much, Taru. I wish to extend thank you also to Taru for and the rest of the steering group for the invaluable help and support that you have given during the project, all the co-investigators, all the collaborating schools and teachers, and practical stakeholders giving us insight, very important insights, and of course the staff of the project. I have a saying that I only hire people better than me in order to be able to do great stuff, and it's all thanks to the employees of the Let's Move It program, the project over the years that we have done these results. And I would like to have all you stand up who have either worked for the Let's Move It project or worked as a co-investigator or practical stakeholder, Saija, Katja, there, Ari, Antti, Johanna, please stand up. Pia, you have also. I want as a ending of the seminar to kind of we could give a round of applause to those who are here who have really made this thing happen. So thank you. And Anja, yes, there are many of you. And I also want to say again thank you for all the research participants and the funders. Like I said in the beginning, this is the closing seminar of the official funding from the Ministry of Education and Culture. But one professor, when he heard the depth of material that we have collected during the cluster randomized trial, he said, "Oh, you will live off that research data for 10 years." So I think that, and I hope when we open the materials for wider use also, that the research community will be able to really use that to advance our fundamental understanding of these key behavior change questions that we currently face. So it's not only applied and forgotten, but also used for research later on. So we hope that you keep in touch, and we still will stay here for some minutes if you want to discuss with the research group or myself. And please visit our website. We will try to always pre-print our manuscripts when we submit them to journals, so that you can read our findings already before they appear in scientific journals to accelerate the dissemination of knowledge. And I'm sorry that currently I don't have the all of these as preprints, but if you are interested in manuscript versions, please do email me and contact me, and we will find a way to get the manuscript draft already to you. So, thank you so much for your interest, and I hope you have enjoyed the seminar, and have a nice day and spring.